if you want to understand the human condition, you must first understand the universe. But a great mystic will say, if you want to understand the universe, you must first understand the self. And they're both right. Because the evidence suggests that we live in a universe that is a self-organizing, intelligent, creative, trial and error, interactive, learning, participatory, informationally, non-locally, interconnected, evolving quantum system.
Well, I think if you observe what's happening in the culture, people are turning more and more. People are recognizing we have neglected a spiritual dimension in our lives, and that we've been encouraged to do that by a materialistic culture. And so there's quite a significant movement in both Northern Europe and the United States and elsewhere in the world to do something about that. And partly that puts a pressure on science to, especially among younger scientists, to ask this question about consciousness, which ultimately becomes a question about spirit.
The Oracle of Delphi said, we need to know thyself. In modern times, we need to complete this by saying, know thyself as a part of an interconnected, rapidly changing and evolving world.
7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. We have ignition.
The story is we were on the way home. My job on the lunar surface was roughly complete, so I had a little more time to look out the window than the other guys did. So every 2 minutes, a picture of the Earth, the Moon, and the Sun would come through the spacecraft window, and in the backdrop of the stars, 10 times as bright as you could ever see from Earth because of the intervening atmosphere that covers our planet. And it was a wow experience, ecstatic, and accompanied by ecstasy just to see this. It was falling in love with nature all over again. See, stars I was seeing out there, and we know that stars are the furnaces that create matter in our universe. And those stars out there had prototyped the matter in my body, and the matter in the bodies of my partners and the spacecraft. And suddenly I was a part of those stars, that we were one, we were all in unity.
And suddenly that was very personal. Instead of being an intellectual knowledge, those were my molecules. And it was a visceral experience, an overwhelmingly powerful visceral experience, and accompanied by a bliss and ecstasy. And I never had that type of experience before. I came to realize that that type of experience is the basis of all religion. It's a transcendental, transformational, transcendent experience, which catapults you out of the normal ego ways of thinking.
Well, if you're going to study consciousness, it only makes sense to turn to the ones who devoted their lives to that. And so you do pay attention to the mystics and the spiritual philosophers, and especially to the core esoteric traditions of the various spiritual traditions of the earth.
What I learned as I did research on what is the nature of this experience I had in space, I had to appeal to some anthropologists that did some research for me into ancient thought systems and ancient cultures, and came up with understanding from the ancient Sanskrit language, the concept of Salvakapa Samadhi. And I asked, what is that? Well, that is a state of mind in which you see things in their separateness, but experience them viscerally as a unity, as a oneness, and accompanied by ecstasy and bliss. And I said, well, that's exactly what I felt in space.
The more you look into this sort of thing, the more clear it is that those effects cannot really be explained away neatly by known scientific laws. There's something mysterious that's left out. And there are just many, many examples of this. And until fairly recently, the persuasive power of science was so great because of its accomplishments that we assumed that everything that was left out that seemed mysterious would in principle ultimately be explainable by the kinds of scientific laws that we have. Now we're finding that that just doesn't seem to be true. We just have to be a little more humble about our science, that's all.
Unless you've had that type of experience, you get pulled away into politics, economics, and other such things, that and the central message gets lost. So my notion in consciousness studies was to bring this idea and understand it, and use the tools of science to help understand these types of consciousness experiences.
Science is all about cause. That's why you have science. You're trying to find the explanation, the causes for the phenomena. Now, if really everything is connected to everything, if there really is only a oneness, everything then affects everything, and everything is the cause of everything in a certain sense, so that the whole idea of causality has to be revised. We have discovered a basic contradiction in Western science, that we assumed that everything could be explained in terms of quantifiable scientific laws, and then we find that the consciousness of the observer can't be ignored.
Science arose as strictly a materialist concept, looking at matter, the interactions of matter, having nothing to do with mind and consciousness, until the end of the 19th century, when Max Planck, Einstein, and the greats of the early 20th century came up with quantum mechanics, which essentially disproved the Cartesian duality, that body-mind didn't interact.
I think for the typical scientist, this is a whole succession of shocks. That is, the first shock is to realize that there's a bias introduced just in the way you create the experiment, and even deciding to do it. And then there's a bias that comes in the perception, because we now recognize how powerfully the contents and the processes of the unconscious mind affect the way we perceive, not just with our eyes, but in every sense.
We consider intuition our sixth sense. In the English language, we call it our sixth sense. It's really our first sense, should be considered that, because it's rooted in the quantum world and was around long before this solar system that we're in came about and we came about.
When you know something noetically, you know it's true, but you don't know how you know it. And essentially, we're involved with research and education relating to the human mind, and getting the topic of consciousness with all of its various ramifications included within Western science, which it has not been.
So we live in a living, evolving, intelligent universe. We're a part of it. We cannot be separated from it, and are all interconnected with the entire system. And that's because we're all made out of matter. And all of the matter comes from that basic energy source we call the zero-point energy field. So consciousness is the heart of reality. Consciousness is how we know reality.
If we go back now and look at the fundamental assumptions, and quantum physics helped here. Quantum physics showed that you couldn't leave out the consciousness of the observer. Well, then, you'd think then that the rational thing to do at that point is to say, well, let's go back and re-examine how we started and how consciousness got left out.
Here we are in a century where every measure of human activity is on an exponential growth curve, and it doesn't take great genius to understand that that cannot continue indefinitely in a finite space. And we have a planet that is a finite space.
This complex society dominated by a global economy is not going to go smoothly into some new kind of spiritual belief system with everything else remaining in place. Absolutely everything's in flux, because the picture of the basic nature of reality is shifting from one thing to another, just as it shifted at the end of the Middle Ages, and we went from one kind of society to another one that's totally different. And we're in the process of doing that again, except about 10 times as fast.
I'm a diehard peacenik. I think war and the fact that we kill each other over who's got the best God and over border disputes is absolutely an abomination and is not civilized behavior at all. It is an outgrowth of the old big animals eat the little, big fish eat the little fish of primitive existence. And we humans have to grow past that.
And we will see increasingly institutional breakdowns that are mysterious. They're not easily explainable. The whole system's in the process of breaking down, but at the same time reconstructing itself. That is, if you look with other eyes in slightly different directions, you can see all sorts of examples of people getting together in new kinds of communities, new kinds of organizations, creating new pieces of a new society with very different value emphasis.
I know that all of the men that have gone into space, one thing they agree on is that we would like to have our politicians and our leadership out there having that look, because it does change your perspective of life. It pulls you together.
There's no solution to one problem without a solution to them all together. And at first glance, that might seem to make the problems much harder and the situation much more complex. On the contrary, it really doesn't, because what it says is what we need is one fundamental global mind change, and all of the problems become much more solvable than they were before. And I think that's what we are somehow intuitively being led to.